me see the slides? All good on the technical side?
Yeah.
Good. Then good morning or good afternoon, everyone. As Jakob already introduced, I'm going to talk a little bit about my work in general, or our work in general, around urban futures. So I think for some of you, it's been the second or third presentation on this topic. But in this time, I think there are two different parts. On the one side, it's a little bit trying to contextualize the work in general and trying to link the different parts which we have been working on. And the second part is focused on the part on the work in Cairo. So what we have been doing there in the last couple of months when I was there as well, but also what we are currently working on and what is planned to come next. And the general topic is uncertainty in urban system design, and primarily uncertainty in the medium and long-term future. And our solution to that, or our proposed solution to that, which is a scenario-based method applied to mobility in Paris and Cairo. The presentation structure will be in a couple of different parts. So I will first do a quick introduction, just trying to outline a little bit what we're working on, why we are doing it, and so on. Then there are two main parts, which is on urban system scenarios. So that's a little bit the method behind which we are working on. The future urbanites always referring to people who are living in urban areas. And I will talk more about that, and then a little bit discussion and conclusion at the end. A bit for the context. So some of you know at least some of the people here. So Flor is most of the time with us, the chair of the Anthropolis chair, and two other supervisors I have here at the Anthropolis chair at IRT System X and Central Spelec, with a couple of different partners, both from the private and public side. And then from September to November, I spent in Cairo, and I was there visiting scholar at the American University in Cairo, and Transport for Cairo, so two different institutions with a couple of hosts. So this is a little bit to outline the different partners, and also the two places you might recognize as relatively similar shaped objects on the map. So these are the two places I will be talking about whenever there's any kind of localization of the work we are doing. Very general start. I think most of you are working on urban mobility, so there are no news in this part, but the reason why we're working on urban mobility in particular is that we have a primarily urbanized planet, which means already today, probably 55–60% of the population is living in urbanized areas, depending how we categorize it. And it's going to be more and more and more, at least according to current estimations. And urban areas in general, but urban mobility in particular, or any kind of transportation in cities, is one of the key emission contributors. So emissions on a larger level, but also local air pollution and so on. But at the same time, it's a fundamental element for making our cities work. So I like to call it the arteries of urban life. So it's a very important and it's important for cities to function well, but at the same time, it also has a lot of negative side effects. Then how can we impact it? So we are not just talking about, let's say, solutions in the sense of a new vehicle or a new service, but there are a lot of different angles from which we can address urban mobility. And this is, for example, urban or spatial planning, which is my original background, behavioral changes. So, for example, how can we nudge people to use one transportation over the other? And then lots of different types of product, services, policies, and so on, which can be designed. And finally, I will talk about sustainable. But then when we talk about sustainable, we talk, of course, about low to net zero emissions, but also about accessibility, meaning that everybody has access to the things which they need. I think we had a lot of interesting presentations from the Chinese partners on this topic. So how do we make sure that people can go to jobs, but also to other places they need to access? And then finally, how we can enable efficient mobility, which means how can we eradicate the long times of waiting and so on. This just to recap a little bit the key challenges on a system level, which is any kind of negative environmental challenges, any kind of social spatial justice element, which is linked a lot to accessibility, but also to other risks which are associated to it, but also the economy, because I don't remember the exact numbers and it depends very much on the place, but there are absurd amounts of time lost in traffic and in other type of transportation every year. And in this way, we also contextualize our work a little bit in the overall UN SDG, in particular 11.2, which asks for the provision of safe, affordable, accessible, and sustainable transport for all, with a particular attention to women, children, persons with disabilities, and older persons. And this part will become relevant later on when I talk about urbanites, so really taking into considerations the differences of what users and non-users in the urban context are, well, need to a certain degree. Then this is those were the challenges on a system level, but we also have a lot of challenges in the process of trying to impact the urban mobility system. And this is what I try to summarize here. So we have a local diversity. You see, some of you might recognize some of them. Up top, you see the Rue de Rivoli just next to the Louvre, which is just being transformed to a bicycle lane, which is an inner city, highly historic, but also highly urbanized area. Then you have the plateau. This is where we are based here in Paris-Saclay, with the new metro line being constructed, but very different density, very different challenges, much more disconnected to the traditional urban mobility system. And then you have a street in Cairo, again, very different characteristics. So whenever we are trying to find a solution, we have to consider the context. And this is why we talk from time to time about place, either localization of futures or urban mobility, but also about the place-based approaches. Second part is uncertainty. So I already introduced it quickly before, but the reason why we talk about uncertainty is that many solutions in the urban mobility context are long-term processes. So a lot of policies are taking a very long time. A lot of solutions take 7 years, 10 years, 15 years from the moment they are ideated to the moment where they're actually there. So when you look, for example, at the metro here, this has been talked about for a couple of decades, but even the actual planning state and until completion is about 15 years. So we need to know a little bit, at least what happens until the point we take it into action. But then, of course, we also want to continue using it. And this is can sometimes be a couple of decades or a couple of hundreds years. So when we decide today, for example, to put a street, or when somebody decided to put a street in a central location in Paris or in Beijing 1,000 years ago, this will probably still be visible today. So this is, of course, an extreme example, but there's a very important element of long-term durations, which comes with the fact that we do not know exactly what is going to happen in the future. And that means, for example, technological changes, how many people, what type of people, what are the preferences which we have, what are the conditions in which we're operating. And the last one is the question of resource constraints. So there's already a lot of work on working with futures, on working with uncertainties and so on. But it normally requires a lot of different types of data, and it also requires a lot of time, resources, money, because it's a very complex process. So we try to do whatever we are trying to do, we try to do in order to make that a bit more streamlined or easier. And generally, we are operating in the context of design. So here we are referring to design as the course of action aimed at changing existing situations and preferred ones. And in order to do that, we need two different things, which is first an understanding of the current and the preferred state. So where are we and where do we want to go? And that's already very difficult in the context of mobility. So many different notions. The second one is how do we get there? And this is the method. So this are the two key elements of our work. And the research gaps which we identified in this particular two fields is that localized urban mobility futures have so far not been modeled in a way which allows us to have a systemic and holistic perspective, primarily on their transitions between different alternative states. And at the same time, there is a lack of methods which allows us to work with future users or future urbanites, so people who are going to use or are going to be affected by urban mobility in the future, in a combined approach, both from qualitative and quantitative design. The according research questions. So I think the main idea, just to underline again, is to support design processes, not necessarily to design things directly, but support design processes of different types in order to get to more people-centered, place-based mobility solutions. To do that, we have three different parts. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the theory, but that's the basis. Then we have the modeling system futures and modeling future urbanites, the two main parts I'm going to introduce. The first part was primarily based on literature, and later there were a couple of interviews, workshops, and other things. I'm going to introduce some of them. And the student project also integrated one of the parts. And for the theory, we are mostly situating ourselves in system transitions, meaning system of systems, complex system engineering, and a couple of different elements around it. Understanding our mobility also as a socio-technical system. Then design science as a science of how can we manage and study and a bit maybe operationalize the processes of design and improve them. Future studies as an element to integrate any kind of things which are not happening today, but in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And urban studies a little bit as the context of any kind of urban mobility related issues. Second one is the modeling system futures. So there are a couple of different base concepts which we have been working on in order to get to where we are now. I'm not going to introduce all of them, just one and a half more or less. And then there's the key part, which is the method. And finally, there is the modeling future urbanites, which is more or less one of the key elements, the first element of the scenario method. And then talking about different approaches. I think some of you might have seen the last presentation where we started introducing a little bit the work on the future personas and future synthetic populations, but I will try to develop that a bit more. And finally, of course, the 3 application cases, and there we'll only be talking about the Cairo case today. Quick methodology. So our problem in the beginning, which I outlined, comes from the requirements or the context of the Anthropolis chair, what we are working on. Then we had the mixed approach where we work with literature, interviews, workshops to get to some initial ideas, and then went back and forth more or less. And then we use the case studies in order to validate them to come to a couple of key contributions which we are trying to make. And one of the things I mentioned already a couple of times is workshops, interviews, and so on. So we really have a high focus on co-creation with different experts from different fields, different disciplines. And this is a bit of a timeline of a couple of the workshops and activities we did. And just to give you a quick idea, the last one was done in Cairo a couple of 2 months ago, roughly. And in that case, we worked with urban planners, with transportation experts, with simulation experts. And we worked on the localization of urban mobility in Cairo. But at the same time, we are not just trying to focus on what the actual outcome of the workshop is, but also try to see what kind of materials, what kind of methods can we use. And this is exactly why I mentioned before the support of design processes. So it's not really about the outcome of urban mobility in a particular place, but how can we find the best ways to get to certain outcomes or certain understandings of, for example, how might it look like if this and this happens? And what we did here was a little bit of kind of A/B testing. So what happens if we change the order of prompts in a workshop? What happens if we give different kind of inputs? I'll talk a little bit more about it afterwards, but this is a little bit to give an idea of what we are trying to do. That brings me to the second part, which is the urban system scenarios. And the question there is, how can we model them in a systemic holistic manner, holistic with restrictions, let's say, in order to permit designing transitions towards alternative future states. The most important one is this one. So this is a revision of a futures cone, which is one of the ways to represent a little bit what future studies is about. So we have one individual starting point today, and from there, as further we go in the future, as more different options are there. So what we are trying to do more or less is try to find out what this can be and how we can work with them. And for that, we can categorize a little bit in possible, probable, or preferred futures, among others. But we can also use some of the combinations of all the different factors which play a role here, referred to as scenarios, and use them to make this very large and complex thing a little bit more tangible in order to work with this. And then when we are talking about scenarios, in this case, we are talking about future scenarios, which means they have a temporal property rooted in the future. So we're not talking about alternative states of today or something like this. We are talking about things which are possible and plausible. And we are talking about a set of different scenarios. So usually at least 3, normally 4 or more, not too many either, but which are meaningful alternatives. So not just one dystopia and one utopia and one we want, but having a set of different scenarios, which are all in some way possible. This is the other elements, but I'm not going to talk about that in detail. The question which we ask then is what happens along this path? So what happens between today and a certain future? And because we needed both to understand what kind of future we might arrive in, but we also needed in order to see how we can impact this transition pathway. And there we talk about 2 elements, which is trends and uncertainties. So trends, we call any kind of anticipated future developments with a high level of certainty, which we assume to hold true for all the different scenarios. So of course, we don't know what's happening. It depends also on the timescale, but currently we're working in the context of most places in the world. We have a population growth, we have an aging society, And a very local example is the metro line, which we have here around our office, which I showed earlier. So it's under construction. It's not 100% sure that it's going to be there, but those are things which we can assume to happen. So for each of the scenarios, we take this as a core element. The second part is uncertainties. And this is where it gets interesting, which is anything what might change. So same thing, we have future developments, but they have a very high level of uncertainty. So we don't know what exactly is going to happen. So that might be a project where we don't know if it's going to take place or not, but it can also be the level of car ownership. So how many cars per household will there be in 2030? What will be the user preferences? How many people will prefer to take one mode over the other, and why? What are the characteristics, let's say, of the choice model behind? What will be the build-up density? Will we go continuously into sprawl? Will we densify? Will we lose population in some of the bigger cities and smaller cities? So there's a lot of different elements behind, which also is a bit the question, if we have a lot of different trends and a lot of different uncertainties, do we have an infinite number of scenarios? So theoretically, yes, but that doesn't make it very tangible to work with. So for that, there's a process which we incorporate it a little bit into our approach, because it's very useful in order to do what we're trying to do, which are archetypical scenarios. And those are groups of scenarios or groups of different trends and uncertainties and other characteristics which are prevalent. So they're done in a general future studies field, but also they've been done for 2030 scenarios from Mishkolsky and others in 2021. So they looked at a lot of different urban mobility scenarios and try to categorize them and say, okay, what are they saying? What are the key characteristics? And then you have, for example, the grumpy old transport, which is more or less transportation continues in the same way as today. There are no significant changes. At an easy pace means there's a small transition in the same way as it happens at the moment. So maybe towards more active mobility and so on, depending very much on the context. So when I make these examples, I primarily talk about Paris. Mine is yours, which is any kind of technology sharing, moving away, or servitization in general. And then tech-eager mobility, where technology solutions are incorporated across most of the different fields of mobility. This, let's say, was, you see it here in the upper right corner, there was the future scenarios part. And the second one is urban mobility. So I talk about urban mobility, but what does urban mobility mean and how can we model it? And for that, you see a little extract, not maybe of the most representative part of the city, but a couple of different components. And when we try to look at all the different things, not all, but some of the key things which are impacting urban mobility, we have land use, we have the energy which is used, we have well, air mobility is not the most common one, but also another part, very important. We have people who are the people moving from one place to another, of course, and so on. And when we try to organize this a little bit, we can categorize them in three different groups. And the first one is anything which is around people. So what are we doing? How are we doing it? Why are we doing it? Where do we have to go? Where do we live? But also active mobility as the mode, which is only linked to that. The second one is any type of mobility. So this is any kind of service, product, or I also include, for example, the charging infrastructure. Because even if this is an infrastructure, it might not be around forever. So these are the things which are a bit more faster to change. And finally, they're the core elements, which is land use, functions, energy, roads, rails. So really the hardware of the city, maybe. And we categorize this in this way to have one element, which is people. So I will talk again several times about this one, services and infrastructures. And we use this in order to model urban mobility as a socio-technical system, as I mentioned before, with three different layers, but also in order to define in order what impacts other parts. So the way we are conceptualizing it, and that's not always 100% true in reality due to other factors, but generally when we have an increase of people, for example, we need more urban development, we need more housing, we need more infrastructure. So any kind of change of preferences, of number, of characteristics of the layer of people impacts in one way the infrastructure. And this is a very long-term development. So it's not something what happens from one day to another. And then both of them, so the existing infrastructure and also the planned infrastructure, as well as people's preferences and so on, are together impacting services. So this is the most quickly changing part, but of course also public transportation is not something super quick. So it's not a 100% categorization, but this is a little bit the logic we are trying to develop. And if we put these two different things together, this is more or less our main idea, which is taking the scenarios, in this case the 4 different scenarios I introduced before, and adapting them to different futures with the use of uncertainties, trends, and other elements to arrive at a set of scenarios which we can use for different kind of purposes, for different design processes. And the idea here is that in the first stage, we are adapting the dimension or the layer of people. So do we have a population growth? Do we have changes in the lifestyle? Do we have changing values? From that, we change the infrastructures. From that, we change the mobility service. So it's a little bit of a iterative process where it does not mean that we don't have a change of people's behaviors, for example, due to some of the mobility services, but still it's approach more to go one step after the other. And my computer is overheating a little bit. I hope you don't have too much noise. If you have, please tell me. Otherwise, what I will be talking about for the rest of the presentation is the people dimension, because this is the first one, this is the most important one, and it's also one of the most difficult ones to model and see how they might develop over the future. And this is to come back to the overall graphic. This is the last part. So future personas, the synthetic populations, evaluation of mobility solutions, as well as the application cases. The question here is how we can work with them, how we can model them and use them. This is a very important part across both qualitative and quantitative design methods, which I think is also a bit representative for the Anthropolis chair, which brings together different disciplines where we are both working on simulation, for example, on the one side, but also on the qualitative design process on the other. I also believe some of you have seen this before, because this was the last presentation, more or less. 2 different approaches how we can model and represent future urbanites, so future mobility users and people affected by it, which on the one side are personas, so a bit of archetypical ideas as well, which is a simplified way to represent people and give them a little bit of a story to allow designers also to immerse themselves. So it was initially developed, I think, by Microsoft in the early 2000s in order to prepare their products for broader diversity than the identity of the designer itself. And on the other side, we have synthetic populations, which are mostly quantitative and we're much more objective, and which are working with census data, a lot of different information in order to have a statistically representative population, which allows us to, for example, do agent-based simulations or other activities around that. And what we thought, well, we know this, we know that, but they are not very often used together. So we try to see how we can use both of them to maybe cross-fertilize the 2 approaches. And this is, if you are interested in this, we are happy to share some more about it, but I'm not going to talk in detail about it. I just want to give a very brief introduction what we did. So we take census data and other mobility information, we cluster them into, in that case for the Ile-de-France region, so the region around Paris, in 28 different proto-personas with different characteristics, test a little bit if they are representative to represent different mobility preference, mobility behaviors. Then we introduce the scenarios through trends and uncertainties in order to redistribute the proto-persona for scenario. So you can imagine if in today, maybe you have, we'll make up some numbers now, you have 10 people who take a bus every day in order to go in the morning to work and in the evening to shopping. Then maybe in one of the scenarios, we might have 11 of that. In another, we have 7, another we have 8, another we have 15. So the idea is to use these different categories, which of course are much more complex than just going to work or going to shopping by bus, but trying to redistribute them across different scenarios in order to feed both the personas, which means we can take information from census, from mobility surveys and so on, to make personas which are much more evidence-based than many of the traditional persona creation processes, while at the same time we also can use it in order to create the synthetic population, which is the main objective behind it, So we can run a multi-agent-based simulation for 2030, not with the synthetic population of today or of the data of today or a couple of years ago, whenever there was the last census, but we can run it with different alternatives of the future and see, okay, how would that impact each of them? And also a little bit, how can we make sure that a solution which we are creating today, for example, works even if less people are living there. So maybe we have a population increase of 10%, then the solution works very well, but there's a probability as well that we have a decrease of population and then it's not going to work. So it's a little bit future proofing up to a certain degree. And we apply this to the 3 different application cases, as I mentioned before. So 2 of them are around here. So one of them on the Saclay Plateau, one on Paris-Saclay. Each of them had a little bit of a different objective behind. So in the beginning, it was mostly on testing the scenarios and testing the persona approach, but we didn't work with the synthetic population for the first one. The second one is, I would say, the core at the moment, which is a collaboration with other people at IRT, most notably Tjark, which also has been presented a couple of times here, which is trying to see how can our method produce different inputs for synthetic population, also synthetic populations, but also agent-based simulations of the inter-council partnership Paris-Saclay, so 27 communities in the south of Paris, to make the process a little bit more robust. And then the third one, which I'm going to talk about now, is testing bus rapid transit in particular, but also other kinds of interventions, a little bit with the same approach as here. So using the interface of quantitative and qualitative design processes and trying to see how we can use it on an overall level to improve accessibility and improve sustainability, but also replicate the work which we have been doing here in a very different context. And just a very brief introduction. So I think most of you know where Cairo is. It's the capital of Egypt. It's at the Nile Delta. It has about 24 million people. So it's one of the most populated areas. It has a lot of different challenges around mobility, such as air quality issues, limited accessibility and resettlements and so on. So there are a lot of people spending hours and hours in traffic every day, or not being able to do certain jobs just due to the fact that they're disconnected to their traditional economic opportunities. We have still very low percentage car ownership, like in many other countries as well, primarily in the global south, but it's rising relatively quickly and it's already completely congested today. So this is maybe less a challenge, but a risk. And there is a regular standstill of traffic throughout the city. And even if there's a lot of investment in infrastructure of different types, it's a problem which remains. So I could probably say that I spend roughly 30% of my research day in Cairo in traffic in one way or the other. And there are difficulties of affordability. So even public transportation is not affordable for everyone. So sometimes the choice between different types of public transportation is already defined by the financial capability of different people. There are many different things which impact urban mobility, as we said before, but here we really wanted to focus on mass public transport, because on the one side, that's something which people are working on currently. So there are projects, many of them with French institutions, on extension of the metro, on other kind of mobility projects. But also it seems to be one of the most promising ones in a very dense city, which has very long distances to match for many different people. But the challenge is a little bit to know where, how, what, and this is what we wanted to focus on. So we wanted to, on the one side, test our method, but at the other side also see how we can assist decision making in that process. Very quick map to show you a little bit the scale. So when we talk about Cairo, mostly we talk here about the center. I don't know if you see my so I hope you see my mouse a little bit. I will move it a bit quicker. So here in the center, you see central Cairo, which is on the right side is most of the old Cairo. the Islamic Cairo, and so on. On the left side here you have Giza, so here the pyramids, for example. And around that you have a couple of new cities which have been produced over the last roughly 50 years, I would say. The latest edition is the new capital, where they try to move all the public sector to a new part. And the challenge in this is that even if here there are a lot of mobility challenges due to congestion and so on, but connecting these places are very difficult. And maybe on a map it doesn't look that absurd, but I think Paris center fits several times only in New Cairo. So the density and the scale of this is immense. And I lived here, I worked many days here. So only bridging this can take roughly, or can take without a problem, 2 hours in peak hour transportation times. And with that as a context, I have to switch up something, sorry. With that as a context, the motivation here is to, as I said, apply and test the method in a different context, but also work in an area which is representative in many different ways for many of the urban, or many of the challenges we have in the urban mobility sector, which is urbanizing metropolis with many, many million inhabitants, but at the same time informality and a lot of other things which are happening. So we identified Cairo as a quite good example for that, because a lot of things are coming together, but also test the approach or test different approaches in a context with limited data. And limited data referring both to, for example, extensive studies on trends and uncertainties, but also on more traditional transportation data, such as information on what kind of public transportation exists. And the method behind was a little bit first to choose the right collaboration. So the two I introduced earlier, to have a good direct access to knowledge and all the information which we can. Spend a lot of time really trying to understand the different components of the urban mobility system. So here you see the first bike lane of Egypt, for example, which has been introduced just a couple of days before the COP27. Then interviews and workshops, but also secondary data collection. So just trying to go around a little bit and trying to see what there is. So here's a team of Transport for Cairo, which have been doing that for the last 10 years, more or less, trying to collect the data which is there, but also creating a lot of data on the ground and making it available for research and for improved decision making. Just a couple of impressions. So this is one of the new main monorail projects, which connects everything on the west-east line, more or less. These are some of the new developments in the new cities and the new towns around the city. And these are some of the more inner Cairo parts. So you see lots of parking. Parking is a topic in itself in Cairo, but also this is a typical transportation system. So you have informal, or a lot of different types of informal, more and less formal, let's say, transportation. And sometimes you might spend an hour or something to try to get to the right place. So the context. I introduced it quickly before, and also looking at the time, I think I'm not going to talk too much about it, but just to show the two different maps of the workshops. So trying to see what happens if we start with uncertainties, what happens if we start with the localization, and so on. Then the objectives, I mentioned this before as well. We want to increase accessibility while reducing emissions and other negative externalities. And we identify the potential of agent-based simulation and use it in order to test large-scale interventions and their impact. For that, there are 4 different parts, and this is the ongoing part. So I would say A and B are ongoing, and C and, well, this should be a D. C and D are outstanding. And this is the plan for the next months, I would say. So we are currently working on making a base simulation work. So this is a continued collaboration with Transport for Cairo, but also other people at IRT System X. And one idea or one concept which we're trying to exploit at the moment is if we can use the proto-personas which we have developed here in the context of Paris, and through the redistribution also adapt them to a different geographical context, assuming that our behaviors around the world are relatively similar. It's just the resources we have, the choices we have, and the distribution of how many people of what category, let's say, you have differs. but this is a work in progress, so maybe it doesn't work, but we hope so. The localization of the scenarios with the help of the archetypical scenarios. Well, we started already with the trend uncertainties, but there's a survey coming soon which will go more into detail on that in the context of Cairo. And then in the future, in this case, the very near future, either the creation of new proto-personas or the transfer of the proto-personas we have already to generate different synthetic populations and personas for a 2030 future. To finally, and this is, so I talk a lot about the methodology most of the time, because this is really the core which we're focusing on, but at the same time, we're also trying to contextualize it in real projects or in real objectives behind. And this is why we have this part at the end to use it in order to evaluate different kind of interventions, how they increase accessibility, affordability, and so on across different parameters. And there is 3 different parts which we focus on: walkability, intermodality, and bus rapid transit. And the reason we chose these 3 is sorry. This has been identified together with the partners there, the local partners. And that on one side, walkability is a big issue in Cairo throughout for different reasons. Sometimes you don't have sidewalks, sometimes you have a lot of traffic, it's difficult to cross streets, sometimes it's the heat, sometimes it's other things. So there are a lot of issues around walkability, and if we could improve them, for example, through improved street design or urban design in general, this could increase the catchment area of different public transportation stations, thus decrease the need to produce more public transportation stations, but also make the overall system more efficient. The second one is intermodality. So in one of the studies which was conducted by Transport for Cairo, one of the key determinants was how many times do you have to change from one mode of transport to another, because you never know when they will come, if they will come, how long you have to wait, and so on. So this is, I think, everywhere it's very important. Here in Paris, it's the same, but there it's even much more important. So if we can improve, for example, the negative impact of intermodal changes throughout the journey, how would that impact the overall system? And finally, there are discussions for quite a while on bus rapid transit, which means a dedicated bus line. I think here it's actually an example from China. A dedicated bus line where no cars are nobody else's, and where you have buses which are nearly at the same efficiency of a metro, but much cheaper. And this is discussed, let's say, on a scale of putting it on Ring Road and other main arteries of Cairo, and what the impact of that could be on the overall system. But the question is, in that case, where, how, and when, and what way. So what type of frequency, for example, what routes, and so on. And all of these 3, we are trying to, let's say, combine a bit the qualitative design. So this is, for example, what kind of interventions could take place in order to improve walkability or in order to improve intermodality, while at the same time testing the impact of an improvement through the agent-based simulation. And the anticipated contributions are that we are trying to have the Cairo scale, meaning Cairo metropolitan area scale, agent-based mobility simulation with, as far as we hope for now, 100% open source data, a set of localized scenarios, which can be also used for other purposes, a set of base personas, which can be redistributed, so what I was mentioning before, and a potential input for decision-making, or at least a methodology which allows to test different interventions. And with that, I just show this. So this is what we are working on now. This is the, let's say, the final stage. And the research question was, well, how can we support design processes? And what we're proposing as a solution to that, or as a partial solution to that, is that we have at the first place, we have the models which are, or we have approaches which allow us to model current and multiple future states of urban mobility systems. Then we focus in particular on the people dimension, allowing us to create several sets of present and future personas and synthetic populations, and have the application with a couple of limitations. So validating any work of the future is always tricky. So there is, we try to address it, but there are some further potentials. And we focused on one of the 3 dimensions as we considered it the most important one. So we have a little bit of the work on infrastructure and service modeling, the 2 other columns in the diagram earlier. But this, the focus now is really on people as it's the first part, which also leads directly to different potential future works. And I think that's about it. So maybe to summarize on a high level, we believe that any kind of design or transitioning towards people-centered and sustainable urban futures requires the consideration of trends and uncertainties. So we need to think about the future in a broader way in order to not work at some point in the future, but in order to make better decisions in design today. And we believe that scenario-based design methods are very powerful in order to do that. However, they are also very resource intensive. So we need to use different tools in order to make it easier or simpler or quicker to work with and more accessible as well across different disciplines. And this is why we introduce a couple of different pre-existing or re-adopted or re-utilized approaches in order to simplify or make the process a bit more tangible. Couple of the references, couple of publications. So far we primarily focused on the first part, and now we are working and also writing more on the last. And with that, I say thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to any kind of questions, comments, either in the next 10-15 minutes or also afterwards by email. Thank you very much.